Hello and welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm John Bachman. Joining us right now is New York Times best-selling author Jay Richards. His newest book is called Infiltrated: How to Stop the Insiders and Activists Who Are Exploiting the Financial Crisis to Control Our Lives and Our Fortunes. Dr. Richards is also the Distinguished Fellow at the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics and a Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute. And Dr. Richards, it's nice to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. So we've been told for years now it was the greedy Wall Street bankers who were the ones exploiting the financial crisis and trying to control our lives and fortunes. Have we been lied to?
Well, if we haven't been lied to, we've been deeply misled. I mean, if you look at the sort of build-up to the crisis in September of 2008, we're now about 5 years out. There's still debate about what the precise causes were, but within 2 weeks of the crisis, there was already this kind of conventional wisdom set in concrete that it was a result of unfettered competition and capitalism and Wall Street greed. It's sort of very hard to speak over that cant, but what happened in the intervening years is that we got the real data, the real information on all these risky loans, so-called subprime loans that were in the system. And what's clear when you look at the actual numbers as opposed to the media cant, that the government's visible hand played a clear role in creating the conditions for the financial crisis, in particular what I refer to as the affordable housing goals, spread out over about 25 different departments of the federal government, all of which were, I think, maybe well-meaning and intended to help lower income people be able to get into homes. The unfortunate consequences over time, though, is that underwriting standards on loans were degraded. It ended up corrupting the system as a whole, and so as soon as the housing market stalled, it was bound to happen. This would not have happened this way if the government had stayed out of the housing market to begin with.
I want to take a look at some specific legislation in just a second, Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. But first, I want to talk about some of the people that you kind of take dead aim at in this book, the Sandler family, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and groups like the Center for Responsible Lending. And you say they're putting their own interests ahead of the people that they are claiming to try and help. Do you think that was their motive from the beginning, to kind of, improve their own standing? Or do you think this was an unintended consequence that followed from good, if not misguided, intentions?
I think it's mostly the latter. Of course, I can't see into anyone's heart, and I do think there are people involved in this story whose motives were simply to increase their own power, especially here in Washington, D.C. But people like Martin Eakes at the Center for Responsible Lending, I think he's a well-meaning left-wing activist. He's just deeply misguided about the way the economy works. And it's the same thing with the billionaires and philanthropists Herb and Marion Sandler, who I talk a lot about in this story. They may be well-meaning, but they pioneered a type of loan called option ARM loans, which is essentially a loan that you could get that had a prepayment penalty if you paid it off too soon, but you could actually pay less than the rate of interest for 10 years on these loans, which meant that borrowers would get deeper and deeper into debt. The Sandlers were fortunate enough to sell their entire company at the height of the housing bubble in 2006 to Wachovia, which then deep-sixed Wachovia in 2008. And with their money as philanthropists, they funded housing activists like Martin Eakes, who advocated these policies that I argue actually led to the crisis.
Now, when you talk about Martin Eakes and the Center for Responsible Lending and Self-Help Credit Union, which he helped found, you make the argument that he's being hypothetical, first because of the business model, but also because of his lobbying efforts in Washington. But I'd be willing to bet that Mr. Eakes might say, hey, when you take on big banks, or you're claiming to take on big banks and these big mortgage companies, you've got to fight fire with fire. So, you got to get involved in the lobbying effort. Would you agree that lobbying is almost a necessary evil these days if you're trying to get anything done in Washington?
Well, it may be. And I mean, of course, lobbying abstractly considered is simply people representing interests or industries and kind of explaining their interests to Congress. It's still up to Congress, the members of Congress and elected officials, to make the right decisions on this and not to be swayed or propagandized by lobbyists. I do think that Martin Eakes and the Center for Responsible Lending are engaged in a heck of a lot of lobbying. That by itself I don't fault them for, because I think there's people on all sides of the political spectrum that do that. Unfortunately, many of the policies and the private lobbying that Eakes did in the 1980s and 1990s, that caused real problems. He was involved in first encouraging and then actually helping to coerce private banks into making a lot of these risky loans that they wouldn't have made on their own. He worked out a deal with a huge $50 million grant from the Ford Foundation. So he was able to buy a lot of these risky loans that he'd encouraged these banks to make and then turn around, securitize them, and sell them to Fannie and Freddie so they're off of his books. He was not the only figure, but a key figure in the degrading of the underwriting standards that Fannie Mae had used up until that point. And so these are some stories from the nonprofit sector that a lot of people don't know about. We didn't just focus on Washington or Wall Street, but in fact the nonprofit sector, housing activists in particular, played a crucial role in this crisis.
Now, let's focus in on some legislation real quickly, and specifically the two examples that you discuss in great detail in the book, at least two of the examples anyway. One is Sarbanes-Oxley, which passed almost unanimously in Congress and was signed by President George W. Bush after the Enron, WorldCom, and Tyco accounting debacles. It was supposed to improve transparency in accounting reporting. And also Dodd-Frank number 2, which passed in the wake of the recent banking crisis of 2008, which we saw the demise of Wall Street institutions like Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns. But which of those two pieces of legislation do you find more problematic and more damaging to our financial system?
Well, I would say if Sarbanes-Oxley, it's just whatever its intentions, it's not doing what it was supposed to do. It clearly didn't stop the financial crisis. Dodd-Frank, on the other hand, I think actually puts in place some of the very policies that led to the crisis in the first place. So the so-called too big to fail mentality, which is really too big to be allowed to fail. That was a kind of implicit assumption that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac had, but that also many of the large banks had. So Dick Fuld, who is the CEO of the investment bank Lehman Brothers, he spent a year prior to September 15, 2008, not preparing for bankruptcy because he was assuming that the government was going to come in with some kind of golden parachute and bail him out. That was an implicit assumption prior to the financial crisis. Well, Dodd-Frank has a provision in which certain financial institutions are dubbed systemically important, so-called SIFIs, systemically important financial institutions, which is kind of bureaucrat-ease for too big to be allowed to fail. So what was just kind of a working assumption for a lot of people in the industry is now part of statutory law, unfortunately, as a result of Dodd-Frank. And so it's not just that it doesn't work, I think it actually solidifies and sets in concrete some of the very policies that caused the crisis in the first place.
And you get into that whole arena of moral hazard and things like that. What you talked about there with Dodd-Frank is a great point, but there, of course, is still a lot of concern from some consumer advocates like former independent Senator Ted Kaufman, especially after this recent J.P. Morgan London whale case. We talked about Ted Kaufman. He argues that there needs to be more regulation, especially in the derivatives markets. Kaufman and others, including Warren Buffett, say these things are real problematic because these are black markets, unregulated markets, things like mortgage-backed securities and credit default swaps.
Yeah, and I talk a good bit about that in the book. And most people, when they hear about credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations, their eyes glaze over because they sound sort of impenetrable. They're not really all that complicated. It's fairly easy to explain, and I try to do that in the book. But what's important to realize is that, yes, everybody needs to be regulated. We can't just be allowed to do what we want to do. But the most powerful regulator in a market is the market incentives themselves. Now, in a normal free market, a bank is not normally going to give out loans that it has good reason to think won't be repaid. Even if you assume the banker is greedy, that's the case. It's only when you change the incentive so that now banks are being strongly encouraged to give out risky loans and then being told that they can sell them right away to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, that changes the entire incentive structure. And so I really don't think that the complexity of derivatives is the problem. And in fact, if anything, those are sort of lagging indicators. The crisis was started in the housing market. Yes, it was made international because of securitization. And so what that meant is that you could get a bunch of defaults on home loans in Detroit, and a little, city in northern Norway could go bankrupt because its city pensioners were fully invested in mortgage-backed securities. So it made the crisis international, but I just think there's absolutely no reason to think that various derivatives, including these, sort of over-the-counter derivatives, actually caused the crisis. It's just that, honestly, I think some advocates are assuming people won't follow the details because they'll think it's too complicated and they won't see the weakness of that argument.
And some folks, say that they should have the ability to, put some of their retirement and investment money in a market that's not susceptible of, to what happens with the derivatives market. That's obviously, a debate for a later day. But, when it comes to the financial meltdown, there's certainly plenty of blame to go around here. You say it's time to stop blaming the banks, but where should we then direct that blame? To members of Congress, to ourselves? Who deserves the blame here?
I would say all of the above. I mean, if you look in 2008, there were about 27 million risky mortgage loans in the system. That was half of all the loans. And 2/3 of those were owned either by government entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, or banks operating under government control under the Community Reinvestment Act or certain HUD policies. So that left about 1/3 of the risky loans in private hands. I think part of the story really, and that's why the book is called Infiltrated, is a kind of cronyism. You can call it, crony capitalism or crony socialism or corporatism, whatever. It's not a simple sort of morality tale about socialists who are trying to get the government to own everything, but rather it's a story of collusion between some large, very well-connected financial institutions, government regulators, and the nonprofit sector. That's why in the book, I refer to this as full spectrum cronyism that involves all these spheres of society, essentially colluding and I think undercutting the beneficial aspects of competition in a free market system.
Now, we talked about Fannie and Freddie a lot. It comes up several points in the book. This is the last question I have for you. President Obama recently outlined his plans to overhaul the mortgage system. He wants to phase out Fannie and Freddie and put more of the private sector in control of some of the risk, as opposed to the government on a lot of these loans. He also wants to expand refinancing for homeowners. What do you think about the president's plan? Is this window dressing, lip service, or do you think he's moving in the right direction?
I'd say it's maybe one step forward, two steps back. I fully agree that the government somehow needs to unwind Fannie and Freddie so that these are not wholly owned subsidiaries of the federal government. So I agree with President Obama there, but he's also made it clear that he still wants the government involved in home loans, and especially in making home loans available and affordable to lower income people. Well, that was exactly the policy that created the problems in the first place. So while I agree with the president and applaud him for saying we should unwind Fannie and Freddie, I fault him for continuing to nurse and to encourage the assumptions that led to the crisis in the first place.
Well, it's a fascinating book, Jay Richards. The new book is called Infiltrated, available on Amazon and in stores right now. A viewpoint you probably have not heard about the financial crisis of 2008. And I really like, too, that there's a lot of great info in there, and you come out of the book feeling like you learned something. And we can all use a little bit of education when it comes to our financial markets these days. Jay Richards, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
Thanks for watching Newsmax TV.